Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. I'm not a stupid fucker, she replied. You've always been a stupid fucker, except for when you were an annoying fucker, or a bald fucker. Sandor said, and she smirked. Better than a hungry fucker or a smelly fucker, she said with a chuckle. There was silence for a moment, and when she turned to look at him, it was too much, and before she knew it, her arms were around him and she was holding him tightly. She welcomed feeling his own arms when he held her in his soft words that she knew he didn't mean for her to hear. Sandor telling her that she was the sister of his heart, and that finding her had been what had given his life meaning, and Dany letting him speak, because she knew, if she did, then he would not. Who let go of who she couldn't tell, but when he moved away from her, it was her that was the first to speak. Don't be a brave fucker. If it comes to it, don't be a brave fucker. She said, her words choked as she fought back her tears. I'll be an angry fucker if I get to this fucking wall and find out they don't have any chicken. Sandor said, and it was a laugh rather than tears he left her with when he walked from the room. Silly fucker, she said softly, a few moments later as she looked out on the bay some more. King's Landing 300 AC. Joy. She smiled as she read the letter from her papa that told her they'd arrived back at Castamere and that they wished she was there with them. It had been the one thing she had felt was wrong about her life in King's Landing. Knowing she'd not see her papa or Shara very often and that it would only be in letters mostly that they'd speak, Jon did let her see them from time to time in the glass candles, though, and he was always there to hold her afterward if she felt a little sad when she did so. Even on the times when she didn't see them, she'd still think of them, and what her papa had told her was what was truly important. We cannot always be with those we care about, princess, so we hold them here, her papa said as he touched his chest. And when we close our eyes, we can always see them. At times when Jon wasn't here, she'd do just that and be able to see her papa, Ashara, Aunt Jenna, and Marcella. She could do so with Cragen and with Arya and Lyanna, with her friends when they went back to visit their parents, and with Jon anytime he was not there for her to see. Though with him she always had other ways too, she thought with a smile as she looked down at the locket she wore around her neck. It had been his gift to her for one of her name days, a golden locket with apples on one side and winter on the other. Inside was a drawing he'd done of them both, and though it was small, it was as clear as a far larger drawing would be. Her golden hair, her green eyes, Jon's dark hair and gray ones, and a word written in Valyrian on the inside of the locket. One single word, but one that meant the world to her each time she saw it, and one she spoke aloud to herself whenever he wasn't here. Hi there, little sister, she said softly. She had dressed and had broken her fast with Jaime, Daisy, Joanna, and little Jon, and now that she'd done so, she hurried to the stables with Ser Brienne behind her. Her sworn shield was someone she was more than happy to have at her back, and though she was never truly in any danger, she welcomed her presence. Ser Brienne was fierce, and she'd seen her beat both Eric and Eric in the sparring yard. They'd both beaten her too, but Jon had told her that Ser Brienne was as good as any other knight, and far better than most, and Joy knew that to be true. She'd been knighted by Ser Briander. He was one of the truest knights ever, and was sung about in song for saving Jon's life. Joy too had sung that song herself, the brave northern knight who'd saved the king's life at the cost of his own. Serewalder the Tall, who fell at the wall and who the realm owed all. She was so very grateful to him, though she'd been wroth with Jon for putting himself in such danger. As she hurried through the Red Keep, eager to be out and about, and on apples, she looked so very forward to the day ahead. Then she gasped loudly as she bumped into Prince Oberyn's nephew, and both of them went crashing to the ground. Forgive me, my lady, I wasn't looking where I was going, Trystane said as he reached down to help her back to her feet. There is nothing to forgive, my prince. You were not the only one who was remiss, she said as she brushed the dust from her riding clothes. An interesting outfit, my lady, Trystane said, and she narrowed her eyes as she looked at him and tried to decide if he was being rude or not. My riding clothes, she said a moment later when she was sure that he was not and was just speaking about the fact that while around her most were wearing dresses, she was not. You're going riding? Trystane asked almost dreamily. I am. His Grace and I are going riding in the Kingswood, she said. Perhaps too haughtily, but she liked that she and Jon rode together. You ride? She asked, when she saw how he looked at her. I do, my lady, though I've left Peaches back in Sunspear, he said, a little sadly, and she could understand that completely, as she often felt that way when she'd left apples behind, though it was the name she found herself concentrating on. Peaches? She asked with a smile. My mare, it's what she most enjoyed eating as a foal, and so I began to call her that, and the name stuck. Trystane said, and she laughed when he did. Lady Joy, Sir Brienne said with a cough from behind her, and Joy turned to her, ready to scowl, only to remember where it was she was supposed to be and who it was she was supposed to be meeting. Forgive me, my prince, but I mustn't keep his grace waiting, she said, and Trystane nodded. Of course, my lady. Perhaps we could ride together sometime. Trystane asked eagerly. Perhaps, she said with another little laugh, and then she heard him do the same as she turned to run to the stables. She rolled her eyes at the look Jon gave her as she slowed down when she saw him. Joy, knowing that, despite being late and the serious look on his face, Jon wasn't truly annoyed with her. They barely said their hellos before they were mounted and riding through the city. Jon riding right beside her, and each time she looked at him, she could see he wished to do just as she did. They got their chance soon enough, and as soon as they were outside the gates, they were off. Apples was ahead for far longer this time, and as she saw the stream up ahead, she felt that victory was close. It was the look behind that lost the race for her, and she was very annoyed with herself when she climbed down from Apple's back. The smirk on Jon's face only adding to that annoyance as they led the horses to the stream so they could rest and drink some water. You had me, Jon said, and she frowned at him. Annoyed still with herself and not with him. I know, she said before she was grabbed and lifted in the air. Stop, Jon, stop it, she said, laughing loudly as he tickled her and at the faces he was making to ensure she laughed. No more frowning, promise. No more, or I'll not stop. Jon threatened, and she nodded through her laughter. As the horses drank, she and Jon took a seat under the tree, and they too had some water. She wasn't hungry, but she was keen to see what it was he had brought in the sack, and so, with a nod to Brienne, she waited for her sworn shield to bring it over to her. Sir Arthur, please dissuade Sir Brienne from her foolhardy task. Jon called out, and Joy looked at him. I just want to know, Jon, she said, determinedly. And you will, when we eat and not before, Jon said, in the very same tone. I could eat, she said, as she was now even keener to know what was in the sack. And you will, when I do, Jon said, sticking his tongue out at her, and making her laugh once more. They sat under the tree in silence for a few moments, Joy leaning back on her hands and looking up to the sun as it shined through the leaves. Jon looked more to her than anywhere else, and after they'd taken another swallow from the water pouch, they got up and walked to the horses. She reached out her hand, and Jon handed her the apple, and they both fed each of the horses before taking the reins and walking with them alongside the stream. What they talked about was almost nothing at all. Little things that no one else would care about, and yet they did. Joy coming close on more than one occasion to speaking to him about Prince Trystane, as she wished to find out if Jon liked his cousin or not. She knew he liked all his other cousins, and for some reason she found herself hoping she liked this one too. For some reason she couldn't bring herself to ask him, and soon enough they were back on apples in winter and riding through the Kingswood. Do you remember your first ride? Jon asked, breaking the silence. When you held me in front of you on my name day, she asked, and saw him nod. Aye. You were so small, so excited, and I knew then that you'd be the very best horse rider in all the realm. Jon said, and she looked at him and shook her head. You're still better than me, she said, speaking truly. No, you're the very best. I'm older, but you had me today for true, he said. And she smiled when she looked and saw there was no lie in his words or his expression. I wish I could ride everywhere. We've done so in the north and Dorne, in the west, and here. I wish to ride in each of the 7 kingdoms and to race in every single one of them, she said as she pictured doing just that. 8, Jon said with a smirk. What? She said. There are 8 now, and so you've another to ride in. A whole new set of lands. Jon said before he looked at her and gave her a nod when they reached the hill. It wasn't truly a race this time. Both Apples and Winter were still a little tired, and so instead they just rode a little faster, but not fully. The spot they stopped at for lunch was a different one than their normal one, and was in a valley. There was only the one tree, and it looked old and alone, and for some reason that made her feel a little sad as they sat and ate their lunch. What cheered her up was seeing what it was that Jon had been hiding from her in the sack. All of them. You brought all of them, she said happily, as she laid them out on the blanket, Arthur, Brienne, and the other guards all taking their own food once she did so. Well, I wished for you to have your favorites, Jon said as she ate her meal and eyed up the peach pie that was to be her dessert. I did not, she said, laughing, as Jon told her stories of her childhood that she remembered and yet didn't. "You did," he said. All over Tyrion, Godzi was so shocked, and he never reached for the last piece of pie ever again. "Or never when you were present. You make me sound like a brat," she said half-jokingly. "You are a brat when you want to be. There's nothing wrong with that, and you're never mean," he said, and she nodded. It was true. She knew that over the years she'd at times been a brat. Jon had encouraged her to be so, and he'd spoiled her far more than anyone else had. Her Aunt Jenna, cousin Jaime, Tyrion, and her papa, all of them had spoiled her, at times. And she knew in their own way it was to keep up with how much Jon spoiled her. So what if she'd taken advantage of that? As Jon said, she'd never been mean, and it had never been malicious. It was only a game, and he'd always allowed her to play. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" she said as they lay back on the grass. The truth about why they were spending the day together had been clear to her since he'd asked her, though she tried not to think about it. "I am," he said softly. "For longer this time?" she asked softly, her voice sounding strange to her. "Aye," he said. "I don't want you to go," she said, and he moved over to her, his hand reaching out for hers. "I don't want to go, but there are times when we must do things we don't wish to. So before we do that, we do the things that we do wish to. Today is one of the things I wished to do. Spending time with my sister is one of the things I wished to do. It's always been and will always be so," he said, looking at her. "It's dangerous, isn't it? What you're doing is dangerous," she said, worried as he pulled her closer to him and held her tightly. "Aye, it is. But I can be brave if I know that those I love are... Can you be brave for me, princess?" he asked, and she nodded. "Will you be brave for Margaery and Aelia? Will you for me, Joy? I need you to be brave when they are not." "I'll be brave," she said softly. "When she's older, I want you to teach Axley how to ride," he said, and her head snapped up to look at him as she worried he was telling her that he'd not be able to. Just like he always had, though. Jon knew what was on her mind. "Oh, I'll be there and watching you both, but I want her to learn from you. I want you to teach her all you know, Joy, horses, yenchers, and how to play games," he said, smiling at her. "She'll have the best big sister that any girl could ever wish for, won't she?" She will. I promise, Jon. I promise she will," she said, and he held her even more tightly as she promised him over and over again that she'd be everything to Yak just as he had always been to her. It was dark when they arrived back at King's Landing, and after leading both horses to the stables, Jon walked with her back to her room. They ate together, which surprised her as she thought her day was over. And he surprised her even more when he asked her if she wished for a story. Despite her being way too big for such a thing, she nodded eagerly, and after she was helped ready herself for bed, she lay there while Jon walked into her bedchamber, carrying a large book. "I made this for you. It was to be for your next name day, but I fear I'll miss it, and so I want you to have it now," Jon said, handing her the book, which she opened and saw it had a little note that was written to her and was filled with drawings. "It's a story that's unfinished, so you'll have to forgive me the blank pages at the end of it. Those are yet to be written, as the future is unknown. Read what it says on the inside cover," Jon said. "I give to you a simple story of a girl and her brother, of a princess and sister of a king's heart, and of their many yenchers together. For Yozier, thank you for making all my days brighter. Your brother, Yoz." She looked at the drawing of the two horses in full flight, and of the two figures on their backs, and smiled as she did so. "Open up to the first page," Jon said, and she did as he asked, seeing the drawing of Casterly Rock. "Once upon a time, in a castle far away, there lived a little princess named Ruki," she said, and saw the beaming smile that Jon gave her, a smile that she loved just as much as she did the owner of that smile. King's Landing, 300 AC. Lore said, "It was strange facing off against Prince Garin. Firstly, the fact that you had to stop yourself from calling him Oberyn, and for that he was grateful that the man wielded a sword and not a spear. Secondly, for him at least, it was because of how he felt when he looked at the man, or when the man looked back at him. He was incredibly attracted to him, and had flirted it than once, welcoming that Garin flirted back, and yet that had been the extent of things between them. As he lost yet again and listened as Garin chided him for being distracted, though it was to no surprise that he found himself distracted once more, he'd been asked by the prince if he wished to set sail with him to the Wall once he had told him that he'd be joining them there, and he'd agreed to it almost without thinking. Only later on had he wondered if perhaps he would be needed to travel with Jay on Rhaenix's back. When he'd spoken to his friend, though, Jay had seemed almost relieved that he'd not be coming with him, something that perturbed him at first, even though it had been what he'd wished for. I have much to do when I get there, and I'll have Arthur and Jarks with me. You can speak more on what it is we face, Loras. Let people hear the tales of it before we get there. Jane had said, though later, as he thought about it more, he was sure that Jane knew of his interest in the prince. Tonight he was to have a family dinner, and Margaery and Elia would be joining them while Jay spent the day and some of the night with Joy. He both looked forward to it and dreaded it at the same time. His grandmother, mother, and father, and even his sister weren't best pleased with his decision to travel to the Wall and fight beside Jay. It surprised him that Margaery had been so against it, or it did until he realized that she simply wished him here instead of there. She couldn't stop Jay from going, and so he'd feared she'd try and stop him, though she had not, and instead had just made it clear she wasn't happy about it. Cheer up! It's only an army of dead men that we face, Garen said with a chuckle as he handed him a mug of water. Only, and here I was worrying about nothing, he japed. Through his laughter, he found his eyes drawn to the prince's lips, his thoughts soon drifting to wondering what it would feel like to be kissed by those lips, and so he was glad when the others arrived to the sparring yard. He smiled at Martin and Tommen as both boys were now learning to joust. Tommen far earlier than he should, perhaps, while Martin had already taken some lessons. It gave him an excuse to move from Prince Garen's side, and he saw the almost disappointed look in the older man's face when he did so. It seems my charges are here. My prince. Perhaps we can speak later, he asked, and Garen gave him a smile that made his breath quicken. I would enjoy that very much, Sir Loras. He watched the prince walk away and found himself admiring not just his form, but the grace and way he moved as well. Other than Jaxley, he doubted he'd seen anyone move in such a way. It was as if he glided rather than walked, and at times he found himself wondering if there was some magical reasoning behind it. Garen was magical too, Loras having seen that firsthand, and he knew, of course, that that was the only true explanation he could offer, as no one else moved, how they both did. Right, you two lessons, first we spar and then we joust, he said as he arrived at where the two boys were waiting for him. God's Martin was good. 3 in 10, almost 4 in 10 name days, and already a match for him. He'd taken the day, but only just, and he was glad to face Tommen a few moments later. Though he too had improved greatly, he'd never be as good as his cousin. On a horse, though he may very well surpass him, and he was already a little better with a lance, and so, after sparring it, was to the stables and running of rings that they headed to. If he was to wager then, he'd say there was a chance that Martin would crown a queen of love and beauty one day, with Tommen, though he'd name it a certainty. It brought a large smile to his face, knowing that it was a little like him and Jay. Both boys were better at one thing in their own way. The gap between him and Jay, with a sword in hand, was a huge one. With a lance it was far closer, and even Jay would admit that he held the advantage. He was pleased to see with Martin and Tommen there was an acknowledgement that this was true for them too. Right, go and wash and change. You both did well today. I'll be sure to let his grace know so when we speak of you, he said, and he saw the proud looks on both boys' faces. Martin then ran straight to his betrothed, who'd been watching on. Was no true surprise, as the two were a good match and a happy one by all accounts. It did, though, make him feel the lack of such a person in his own life. And so his mood was soon changed, and didn't improve as he made his way to his family's rooms that night for dinner. He wasn't sullen or even upset, but there was an air of sadness that his mother, father, and grandmother picked up on. Loras hoped they believed it was his thoughts of leaving that caused it, and not the truth of things. Is Margaery not coming? He asked when the first dish was served. Your sister will be along momentarily, perhaps seeing her and your niece will cheer you up, his grandmother said, and at first he thought it was a barb aimed his way, only to realize that it was very much not. She was concerned about him, and so he tried his best to put aside his feelings for now, and when Margaery and Ellie arrived, he found he could at least pretend to. Not that he needed to pretend when it came to his niece, as just being around her was enough to make him forget his worries. It was after dinner that his worries and doubts really began to raise their heads, and that his family all tried to get him to change his mind about the war. Didn't help much in that regard. His Grace doesn't need your sword, son, and her Grace and the princess certainly do, his mother said. I know you wish to fight, lords, but given what his Grace said, it may very well be that here is where you're needed most. Willis added, I don't wish you to go, Lorsier, Alia. We want you here. Margaery said, and Loras looked at her as she held Elia in her arms, and then at his grandmother, who, though she said nothing, he knew it was her who was behind their concerns. I've fought against what is coming, he said. only for his grandmother to interrupt him. Which is why having you here is so very important. You know what it is we must prepare against, and you can help train the guards and others to do so. And let my king and my brothers fight without me, he said, almost angrily. I know it's safer here, and that's what you wish for me, and believe me, I'm not doing this for honor or glory. This isn't some passing whim and me thinking that I'll write my name in legend. My king, the closest friend I've ever had, is risking his life, and I'll not allow him to do so without my sword. I swore an oath when I put on this white cloak, and were it for that alone. Then I'd go where my king goes. Lorsia, his father said, and Loras shook his head. Were it for that alone, father, I'd still go. But this is about more than that oath. More than this cloak, the oath I swore is more than to my king or to my brothers. Jaime is my brother by choice, my good brother and the father of my niece, he said, looking to Marguerite and Elie. For almost 10 years I've been by his side, and I'll be by his side. In this too, were I not then, I'd not be able to live with myself, he said softly. He didn't bring them around other than Marguerite, his sister kissing his cheek and thanking him for being by her husband's side for all this time. His mother and father were worried, his grandmother angered, and Willis fearful, and so by the time he left his family's rooms and made his way back to his own, his mood had gotten worse. Perhaps that was why he'd been so distracted, and maybe it was the reason he found himself knocking on the door and face to face with Prince Garin when he opened it. Can I come in? He asked, worried that he'd be sent away, and relieved when the prince nodded and the door then closed behind him when he walked into the room. King's Landing 300 AC. Jaime. Jael held the petitions, some days and Marguerite others, and he knew they did so to give him time to spend with his family. He'd argued with his king, his son, they'd argued, sparred, argued again. And finally, Jay had agreed that he would be by his side when they stood at the wall. There was nothing he could say to change his mind, and by the gods, had Jay done everything he could to get him to do so. Jay was almost certain that at one point in their arguments that he would be getting ordered by his king to remain in King's Landing, and he was ready to resign as Hand of the King when his duties as such were brought up. No, you can't. You have to stay here, Jane said, after their spar. I have to lead the men of the West, he said calmly. Someone else can do so. I can do so. You're not needed. Your place is here. Jack said his anger a front for how he truly felt. So what? You'll let Tyrion go and Jerian go, but not me, he said, annoyed. Tyrion isn't going. No, you need to stay. Marjorie and Elia will need you. Tyrion said as he found something he felt he could use to keep him here. There will be enough people around her, Grace, who can do as I can, while there will be fewer around you who can, he said. I said, no, gods, why can't you? Jane said, his hands brushing through his hair as he looked at him in frustration. It's my place to be there by your side, as it has always been, he said to a shake of his head. It's your place to be with Daisy, with Jon and Joanna. You've served your time by my side. You're not a damn Kingsguard, damn eh? Jay said. I've always been a Kingsguard, but you can end this. Beat me, he asked. What? Jay said. Beat me, and I'll not go. Beat me and show me that you don't need my sword, he said. And never had he seen such a determined look on Jack's face as he did then. When they sparred, 10-8, he'd beaten him, and TMA wasn't certain that it was his skill that had won him the day. Luck, fate, the gods, whatever it was, something had decided that he should win. As for most of the spare he'd felt on the verge of losing, Jaime had actually thrown down his sword and stormed away, leading him and Arthur to pick it up and follow him, and Arthur to then try and talk him out of it. He was not the only one to do so over the next week or more. Tyrion and then Daisy trying to talk him around, and a rift had formed with his wife when he'd refused. It was to thoughts of healing that rift that he found himself lost in as he walked to the small council chambers. Lord Montfort and Lord Oraine had already set sail, as had Kevin and the Western Fleet. They were heading to the Bay of Ice, while the others headed to Eastwatch. In a few more days, he would set sail on the Lady Joanna and head for Eastwatch, along with Prince Garen's own flagship, the Lady of the Rowing. Loras would travel with the prince, and Jaime had been pleased, if not a little worried, when he'd realized how close the two had become. Though seeing the cheered looks on Loras's face had won him over in the end. Lord Hien, Sir Richard Lonmouth said as they walked into the small council chambers. You going to try and talk me out of it too? He asked, half in a jape. What? No, it comforts me knowing you'll be there where I cannot, Richard said, surprising him. You're not coming? he asked, surprised. Orders from my king, Richard said, and Jaime nodded. Truth be told, as good a blade as Richard was, he was of more use here than he would ever be there. They didn't have too long to wait for the others to arrive. Gramsir Gorman Wellis and Wyman Ilaria, who was serving as Oberyn's stand-in as Master of Laws, and Olenna, who would serve as his own once he left. And finally, Jia himself, along with Barristan. He looked far more relaxed than he had been, and Jaime knew that was simply because he'd done almost all he'd wished to do. They'd held their own private dinner, just him, Daisy, Joanna, and Jon, along with Jia, Margaery, and Ilya. As he was prone to do, Jia spent far more time with the children than he did with the adults. Though he did speak to Daisy more than once in private, and Jaime knew what it was that he was saying, even if he'd not heard the words themselves. I've called this meeting to prepare you for what may be to come. Prince Garin has agreed that Tyrion will play host to as many of our people as is possible. And should the need arise, then the entire court is to head there as soon as they are able. Tyrion said, not allowing for greetings or a moment to be wasted. Would it not be better to simply move in stages, your grace? Willis asked. For those closer to the north, yea, for those up here. No. We can move far more people more quickly from King's Landing than anywhere else. As for the others, as I said with those we can move them differently. From the north to Lannisport and the Iron Islands, from the west to Old Town, from the Reach to Dorne and Dorne to Essos, and so on, Jack said. Do we have the ships? Olenna asked. No. But we make do with what we can, Jay said. The people must be moved, and so I've given the fleet orders to make ready at Sea Dragon Point and White Harbor, Lannisport and Old Town, Maidenpool and Gulltown, and here in King's Landing. Should the worst occur then, Westeros won't hold, and all that avails is flight, Jay said. And Jaime saw the way each of them looked at him. Contingencies only, your grace, he said to a small smile. Every plan requires contingencies, Lord Hand. A wise man thought me that. Jack said and gave him a truer smile. What of the army, your grace? Without the ships, Sir Richard said, and as he spoke he realized what it was that Jack had planned. We go to fight, Sir Richard. There is but one way that fight ends. We win or we die. There is no retreat and no surrender, no offer of terms and no kneeling, James said, and Richard and the others nodded. We will leave within the week, James said, rising to his feet. Barristan behind him as they walked from the room. Jaime wished to stay and speak to the others, and yet he found that he was alone in this, so he made his way back to the Tower of the Hand and walked into his room to the sounds of his daughter's laughter. Papa, look, she said, as he looked to see Jon sitting on her little wooden horse, Daisy holding him in place as it rocked. Jon ride, Papa, look, he's smiling. Aye, he is little cub, just like you did, he said, and she nodded enthusiastically as she remembered her own laughs when she had done so for the first time. His daughter had graduated to truer horses since then, first with he and JCA holding her up on them, and then with her own little pony. And soon with the horse that Jay had gifted her, that was one of Winter's foals. Lion she'd called it after she'd called and named her pony. Bear, she'd only ridden it a couple of times, but it was already clear she was born to be in the saddle, and he'd not even fought Jay when he'd brought the horse to her. It was not only pointless to do so, but he'd not removed the smile from her face that she wore when she and now Jon were on a horse. He can ride, Bear, Papa, she asked, and Daisy shook her head. Jaime almost ready to say he could just to rile his wife up. When he's bigger, little cub, like you were, he said, and Joanna nodded. At a nod from Daisy, he took over with Jon and soon had the horse rocking a little more quickly. He then handed his son to his wife and lifted Joanna up, despite her protests, his daughter soon laughing loudly as the horse rocked away. Later they ate dinner and he put Joanna to bed while Daisy did the same to Jon. He'd not spoken to his daughter about his departure and he wasn't looking forward to it. Or was he to the departure itself? Is she sleeping? Daisy asked as he walked into their room. Aye, I'll need to tell her soon, he said as he began to undress. Aye, you will, Daisy said snippily. Dace, no, I asked you not to go, Janie has asked you not to, and yet you've decided to do so anyway. His wife said angrily. You think I want to? That this is what I sought? Daisy, gods, I wish there was another way, and that Jay was another king. I know how much it worries you, him, and how angry and worried Joanna will be when I tell her. He is my son, in all but name, Daisy. He's been my son from the moment I took him from Winterfell, This isn't me following my king, it's me doing all I can, all that I'm able to make sure that my son comes back from this war. Jaime! Arthur and I have spoken often, you know how much he loves JTA, probably even more than he did Rhaegar, Rhaetier, Elia, or Aegon. He loves that boy, the hope he gave him back, the things he's done, the fulfillment of all his promise. Each day he sees Jay, it makes the loss of Rhaegar and his family almost worth it. Almost, because no matter what Jay is to him, Arthur still blames himself for not being there on the Trident. When Rhaegar fell, he blames himself for not being there when Elia, Rhaetier, and Aegon, he blames himself. And it almost broke him. It would break me, he said sadly. What would? If he fell, if Jade fell, and I was here, even if it was where he ordered me to be, even though going is breaking my heart and staying would be so damn easy, were we to win and Jay to fall, seeing Jon grow, Joanna grow, watching as Yaeli became the queen she'll one day be, and being with you, none of it would fix the hole in my heart that his loss would put there. Dace. My life would be one of regrets, anger, and not even the love I feel for my family would be enough to not make me hate myself for not being there for him, he said as she got out of the bed and he welcomed her arms when they went around him. I love you and your family need you, Jaime, all of them, so... I hate it, but I understand, she said softly. I will come back, Jace. I swear it, and Jay and Loras too. I'll bring them back, not even the god of death himself will stop me. I swear it to you on the old gods and the new. Come to bed, my love. King's Landing 300 AC, Jax Loras, Targaryen. As the days counted down and he almost checked things off his list, he felt the weight being removed from his chest. He'd argued, cried, laughed, spent time with those he loved, and tried to fit as much of everything he could into every hour that he could. Each night he'd make love with Marguerite and hold her in his arms. She'd sleep, and he'd stay awake and watch her until his eyes grew too heavy for him to do so. Then the next morning he'd wake and spend the first part looking at them both before sparring with Martin and Tommen, with Yome, Arthur, Loras, and Barristan, or he could fit in before he then made his way back to his room, just in time for them to wake. He'd see it through Ghost's eyes or hear it through his ears. See Marge stir or hear Ella's cry, and then he'd be gone and up the stairs in the blink of an eye. Jack spent his time with both his sisters and wrote them and many others letters just in case, hoping that he'd not left anything unsaid. Marjorie, Elia, and he had visited orphanages. Sorella and her girls, merchants, and the people who lived in Flea Bottom. At times he'd flown in the sky, just him and Rhaenys alone, and at others he'd walked through the Red Keep with Ghost by his side in the dead of night. Almost as if he was ticking things off an imaginary list, and today was no different. Marguerite stood on the balcony with Iya in her hands, her mother, grandmother, and father beside her. Jaime was there with Daisy, Joanna, and Jon, while Joy stood with Sansa, Willas, and Trystane, who he narrowed his eyes at when he spoke, and made Joy laugh. His aunt was there with his cousins, and Tyrion stood with Dantia and Moan and Shiera. Each and every member of the Kingsguard was present as first he and Tommen, and then he and Martin sparred. Both of them had gotten so very much better, and he longed to see what they would one day become. He hoped to see it with a look to Marguerite and then to Wyman, who was standing beside Willa. Jay brought the spar to an end and placed the sparring swords back on the rack. Sir Arthur, if you will, he said, and Arthur handed him Blackfire. Martin Lannister, kneel before your king. Your grace? Martin asked, confused. Kneel a boy and rise a knight, Martin. Your king demands it of you, he said as Martin looked at him with disbelief before doing as he bid. Martin Lannister, in the name of the warrior, I charge you to be brave. In the name of the father, I charge you to be just. In the name of the mother, I charge you to defend the young and the innocent. In the name of the maiden, I charge you to protect all women. In the name of the smith, I charge you to help those in need. In the name of the crone, I charge you to offer counsel. In the name of the stranger, I charge you to kill only when necessary. Arise, Sir Martin Lannister, a good and true knight of the realm. He sheathed Blackfire, and as Martin rose to his feet, he clapped, and so each and everyone present did likewise, Jay moving to speak softly in Martin's ears. Never forget that you were knighted because you deserved it, Martin, not because you were mine own squire, he whispered to a nod from the boy. With that, he had only one more thing to do before he said his goodbyes to Marguerite and Alia, and they flew north. One more day, that was all he had, and he'd done almost all that he could. He waited until Martin had run over to Tommen and smiled as he saw them both speak. The look on his other squire's face, one of pride and not jealousy, and Jay knew he, too, would be a good and true knight one day. With a nod to Jaime and a look to Marguerite that told her it was all his time, he walked to the godswood and took a knee at the weirwood before he offered up his prayers. The tree had grown and was now of a height with him, and he'd planted one of the seeds on Dragonstone and one in Queen's Crown. In time he'd plant them all. Each of the Targaryen keeps would have a weirwood in its godswood, and the south would know the favor of the old gods one day. Who the people prayed to, what gods they believed in mattered little to him. The seven who are one, the red god, the old gods, and the drowned one, all were welcome in the 8 kingdoms, and all were equal in his mind. You wished to see me, your grace. Yada said as Jaehaerys rose to his feet. I may not be able to stop you from coming, but I'll be damned if I don't see you're protected once you're there. A great swordsman needs a great sword, and this has to be used for more than just knighting boys, he said as he unwrapped the belt and took the scabbard and handed it and Blackfire to his father by choice. Jade, I can't give it back when you're done with it, he said as Jaime took the sword from him and nodded. I leave on the morrow, and I'll not say goodbye it's not that for us, but I will say thank you, he said, looking at Jaime, who had stopped looking at the sword and was looking at him now. There is no need, Jaime said softly. We both know that's not true, he said with a smile. I'm here today because of all you've done. I'm ready to fight because of all you've done. And when I win, it'll be because of all you've done. Thank you for being the father I chose, and the one I needed, he said as he walked away, knowing that if he stayed any longer his tears would begin to fall, and there would be enough of those later that night, as it was. Later he once again ate in his room with Marguerite and Elia, Ghost and the Indigo Dragon. He spoke to the dragon out on the balcony and told her to fly with the others tonight. She'd not be coming with them, and he could feel her sadness over that, but her place was by his daughter's side, and she knew that even more than he. Ghost was even harder to say his goodbyes to. The White Wolf was torn between coming with him and staying here, and was it not for how he felt about his wife and daughter, then he'd not have agreed to do as he begged him to do. Jaehaerys closing his eyes and finding the door as open as it had ever been. Protect, love, and be there for our family should I not be able to be, he told the wolf, and the sweep of his tongue over his face was all the answer that he needed. From there it was to his daughter, and whether she knew or there was some other reason. He actually wasn't tired even though she'd just fed. Taking her in his arms, he lay down on the floor and put her sitting astride his chest. Never did I hope for something as perfect as you, little dragon. Never did I imagine the gods would gift me so. My heart belongs to you and to your mother, and always will. Now close your eyes and dream, Elia. Dream big and dream often, and I swear to you that all your dreams shall come true. You are the very best of me. The greatest of my achievements is that I'm your father. It's my greatest success, and my proudest moment was the day you were born. Nothing will ever surpass that, my love. Nothing can, and nothing can ever take the place of you in my heart. I love you with all that I am, and all that I ever shall be, he said as he kissed her forehead. She fell asleep against his chest, and Marguerite left them both alone for a few more moments before she came and took her from him, and then placed her in her crib. Then his wife came back and held out her hand, as she then led him to their bed. They undressed each other slowly, neither speaking, and only when they had finished doing so did they even move. Jagsel to Marguerite's lips as she kissed his forehead, his cheek, and then finally his own. Their coupling was soft and tender, both of them exploring each and every inch of the other, and when his release finally came, it almost shattered him. It took him some time to get his breath back, and to be able to speak, and when he was able, he found he took some time to find his words. I love you, Marguerite. I've told you often, I know. But gods, I love you so very much. I can't even imagine what my life would have been like without you in it. What my dreams would have been like, or how I'd have gotten through some of the things I have. You gave me the strength to do so. You give me that strength still, he said, looking at her, his fingers softly touching each inch of her face. As you do me, Jay, she said. I'm ready, Marge, truly. You were right. You're always right, he said with a smile. I've left nothing unsaid other than to you and all things I need to tell you. I've already done so. So I'll just say this. I've seen a future, my love. A future where Atia is not the only one of our children. where each of them has their own dragons and a mother and father who are there for them to help guide them through life. I've seen it as clearly as I've seen myself walking through Valyria and bringing the dawn. I feel it to be true, in here, he said, touching his heart. She leaned forward and kissed his lips, and he saw that smile appear on her face. That smile that had captivated him from the first moment he'd seen her in Lannisport all those years ago. I love you with all my heart, and I love our daughter with all that I am. The gods have fashioned us for love for a reason. Margar, they did so because there is nothing in this world more powerful than that. Not magic, not steel, not even the flames of a dragon can come close. I love you both, and I need no more than that to bring the dawn, he said as he kissed her, and outside their window, the sun began to rise. Eastwatch by the Sea, 301, Arthur. He knew how hard it had been for Jaime to say his goodbyes, and his own had been just as difficult. Arthur had spoken to Barristan alone, the two of them telling stories of days long past, and men who fell, and both saying how happy they were that they'd gotten to serve together once more. It was not something he had ever expected to come to pass, and he was glad that it had. There was no finality about their goodbye, no sense that they'd not see each other again. Instead, it was far more simple than that. Barristan had told him that he wished he was going in his place, and yet he was comforted that he'd be by the king's side. Arthur knowing what he meant by that, and telling him of his own comfort that he was there by the queen and princesses. That was the truth of things, and it was a truth that he knew that Jaime felt just as keenly as he did. Though the enemy they faced was far different than the one in the rebellion, the stakes, if anything, were even higher. For more years than he cared to think about, he'd blamed himself for not being by his prince's side, even though he'd been where he was meant to be. Barristan had blamed himself for not being by Yauye and the children's side, even though he too had been where he was meant to be. Now at least both of them were in a way being given the chance to right that wrong. He would be by Jaime's side, and Barristan would protect his wife and child. Perhaps this time they would be the right men for their tasks, and would see a better outcome because of it. They stopped for the night in the hills that overlooked the keep at Widow's Watch, and for once he welcomed the cold air of the north. Jay played his harp as they sat around the fire and told stories and japed at each other's expense. Joe was laughing as he told stories of the things his king and Joy had gotten up to when they were children, and Arthur lapping up each and every morsel that was thrown his way. It had been a good childhood, one that he was happy Jay had known, and his only regret was that he'd missed so much of it. Remember the first time you truly brought her riding? Me and others were behind you, and even we weren't sure you should go so fast. Jir said, laughing as he drank some ale from a pouch that Jay had made sure he'd brought with him. Aye, what was it? He said again. Jaxed his own smile full. I do not think Lady Jenny will approve of this, Jir said as Jane burst out laughing. He was right about that, Jay said a few moments later. Tualiol is in being right, Jir said, raising the pouch. Tuosier, Jay said as he raised his own that was filled with water. Arthur listened to more stories, and he watched as Jorah's eyes drooped as he got tired, and then as Jorah helped him to his bedroll. Being put to bed by a king, not many knights could claim such a thing, and certainly few Kingsguard. And yet, as he looked on, it was not a king or a knight he saw. It was a boy and a man who'd been by his side for most of his life, a man who was more than a guard to him, though with Jay that was true about them all. I wish you'd had a chance to know him, Arthur, to see how good a man he was. His son is Sir Davin's squire now, cupbearer, and page really, but squire he'll be one day, and his daughter is being tutored and wishes to be a seamstress when she's older. A shop in Lannisport that is to be hers and hers alone, and it's not even close to what I owe them, or enough to make up for the years they've spent without their father. Jake said softly after he sat back down by the fire. Jaxley, how many more good men am I to take from their families, Arthur? How am I to make up for that to their wives and children? Jay said almost despondently. What's the alternative, Jane? What else can be done? It may fall upon you to end this fight, but it falls upon men to fight it. Does it not? Me, Yers, Loras, Yaborin, and every other man that's been called will or do know that this isn't a war you started, nor one you wish, but it is one that must be fought, and so you make it up to them by winning it, because if you lose, then it matters not about feeling sorry for their families, they'll have none. Arthur said, and Jay looked at him and nodded. He was a good man, Arthur, and I miss him each and every day. Jake said, wiping his eyes as he got up and walked over to where Rhaenys was laying. Art was a good thing. compassion, sympathy, and empathy each was far better to have than not, and his king had them all in spades. Over the years that he'd been by his side, he'd seen him as far more of his mother's son than his father's. Jay was far happier than Rhaegar had ever been, even with Lyanna by his side. Yet just as his father had, he too took things to heart far too much, and when he did, it was like he was sitting with his prince instead of his king. He bounced back quickly, though, and his words seemed to get through a little easier, and so, when they woke the next morning, it was Lyanna's son that he saw once more. After they had broken their fast and washed, they were soon in the air once more, and just seeing the sheer number of ships assembled along the coast as they flew to Eastwatch was awe-inspiring. Rosirnash ships, Dornish ships, ships from the Valyrians and the Manderleys, pinnacles, smaller ships, and long ships from the Iron Islands. An entire fleet ready to evacuate each and every person from this side of the north, and Arthur knew it was the same on the other side. They landed near the large encampment that the free folk had named their home, and after dismounting from Rax's back, they made their way to speak to the clan chiefs. Jaintir didn't stay long, and just made sure the men knew to make for the ships, if the worst was to happen, and to do so quickly, and then he watched as his king knelt to speak to some of the wargs, and he believed to some of their familiars too. They were soon back on Rhaenix's back and back in the air, and as he looked down, he saw the wall itself come into view. Arthur shuddering as he began to think about what was on the other side of that wall, and that soon he'd be facing off against dead men once more. Castle Black 301 AC. Ned. There had been a time when he had considered sending his nephew here, a time when he had thought what was best for the realm was to send the true king to the wall. As Castle Black came into view and he saw it for what it truly was, Ned shuddered to think of how catastrophic that could have been. Not just to the realm at large or the north, but to Jacaerys himself, trying his best not to let his guilt get the better of him, and to let himself instead concentrate on the fact that fate and Jaime Lannister had intervened. Ned climbed down of his horse and was soon face to face with Jacaer Mormont. "Gods, Ned, it's good to see you," Jacaer said, smiling, as Ned did likewise. "You too, Jacaer. Have any of the others arrived yet?" he asked, as he took in the buildings that had seen better days. "Hey, Ned. Kirstark arrived a day or so ago, and we received a raven from Last-Hearth. Apparently there's to be a wedding before the Umbers leave," Euron said with a smile. "Any news from His Grace?" he asked, as Robb and Cregan joined him. "Not as of yet. The Dornish have arrived at Eastwatch, and word from the Shadow Tower says ships have been seen bearing lions' banners." Ned couldn't help but feel some pride in his nephew for that. He doubted that Robert could have united the realm the same way that Jacaerys had. The old enmities that had remained from the rebellion, not allowing him to, and Robert's own nature, would have caused even more issues. A part of him still mourned the man he had once named his brother by choice, but over time he'd come to realize that it was the thoughts of rather than the reality of the man that he mourned. With a nod to Robb and Cregan, he followed Jair up the stairs to his solar, taking in more of his surroundings as he did so. The wall loomed majestically over Castle Black, and it was all that was majestic about the place. Over the years he had heard how Jaehaerys and Jaime Lannister had sent supplies, coin, and even tradesmen to help rebuild the Watch and its keeps. While there was evidence of their work around him, it was clear they'd not done enough, or that the buildings had been in such a state of disrepair that they'd not had time to. Ned was pretty certain it was the latter, as he knew his nephew would not have let Benjen and Aemon suffer these conditions for long. "Lord Stark," a grim voice said, and Ned almost didn't recognize Stannis Baratheon when he saw him. "Lord Stannis," he said, almost without thinking. "Not a Lord Stark, just a brother of the Watch now," Stannis said as they entered what he assumed was the Lord Commander's rooms. He was happy to see a fire lighting in the hearth, and he could see by the looks on their faces that so were Cregan and Robb. Taking the seat when it was offered, he accepted the mug of ale and smirked to himself at Jair shooing away a raven from his desk. The bird flying to the nearby window and asking for corn when it landed there. "We've not sent out any rangers as per His Grace's instructions, but the men on the wall have seen nothing, Ned. I know what's out there. Stannis has seen them for himself, so I know better than to argue with a king. But do you really believe they march our way?" Jack's his tone a mix between disbelief and hope. "I know His Grace has called on the entire realm, Jack Fleor. The North Dornine, the West, Reach, Stormlands, Riverlands, Crownlands, and even the Iron Islands. All of them march our way. The largest army of men I've ever heard or read about, let alone seen. My nephew has made plans to evacuate the North. He's placed ships on standby to take as many people away from here as they can carry. You met him, both of you. He turning to Stannis. Do you think him a man who does things with no reason? No, Stannis said firmly. I wasn't suggesting, Jaintir said, and Ned waved his hand. I know that, Jair. Neither was I. I wish it were so, though, he said, with a chuckle that Jair joined in with. We'll see you and your men housed, Ned, though it's going to be a tight squeeze, Jacker said worriedly. We're Northmen, Jar. We can save the comforts for the boys from the south, he said to another laugh as he finished his ale, and rose to his feet. I'm glad to have you here, Ned, truly, Chuar said, and Ned looked at him more seriously than he had so far. As am I for you both. It won't be for a lack of good men that we suffer in the days to come, he said to nods from both of them. A young man led him from the Lord Commander's rooms to what he was told was the King's Tower. Ned, seeing Rickard Karstark and his boys walking his way as he did so. It didn't take them long to settle in, and after speaking to Jory, he found that only a small number of his men would be sleeping indoors that night. The rest would have to make do with the tents and the fires they'd set up to keep them warm. Robb and Cregan went with Harry and Karstark to see that their men had all they could give them. Ned glad to find out from them both that the stocks at the wall were in a far better state than the buildings. Later that day he watched as Robb, Cregan, and others sparred in the yard, his nephew proving himself to be unmatched with a sword in hand, and he knew that was mainly down to Arthur's teaching. He was informed that the Reach men had arrived at the Night Fort under Sar Garland, Matthias Rowan, and Randall Tarley's leadership, and he was glad to hear it. It had been Randall who'd handed Robert his only defeat during the rebellion, and they would need men like him to see them through here. When the offer came to see the top of the wall, Robb, and Cregan accepted, and they were joined by Rickard and Harrion as Stannis led them to the lifts. Ned could feel the chill in the air as the lift rose, and soon enough they had reached the top. Heeding the warning from Stannis to mind their steps, he and the boys were brought through the cut-out passages of ice and to the gaps that looked out onto the lands beyond the wall. Once there, he heard both his son and his nephew's gasps at the sight they were presented with. In all his years in the north, he'd never seen the like of it. The sheer expanse of white that stretched out below him and the trees off in the distance, almost looking like they came from a different land to the one he'd known all his life. It was the north, but not the north at the same time. The true north, he'd heard the free folk name it when he'd spoken to Benjen in Queen's Crown. There was a beauty about it, a wild and untamed beauty, and, for some reason, he found himself thinking about his sister. He felt the tear as it fell down his cheek, and as he wiped it away, he hoped that it went unnoticed by those who stood with him. What defenses do you have, Stannis? He heard Robb ask, and he turned his head to see Stannis show him some of them. Mainly rock and arrows, Lord Stark. The wall also has a great blade that can be used should someone dare to climb it. Stannis said, his voice as grim as the look on his face. What fool would dare to climb something this big? Cregan asked incredulously. Speak to the free folk when they arrive and name them fools, my lord. They'll tell you tales of men who've climbed the wall more than once, and if that's not enough to make you believe them, then remember one thing. Stannis said, and Cregan wasn't the only one who listened more carefully. What Stannis said next, what we're to face here, are not men. That was the thought he had in his head as they ate with Jair and the men of the watch that night. What was coming for them were not men. They'd not be forced back and shiver when they saw their numbers. They'd feel no fear of them and the dragons that were on their side and not care about the losses that were inflicted upon them. There would be no retreat, no parley, and no surrender. For the things that came their way feared not when men feared. Why would the dead worry about dying after all? His sleep was filled with terrible dreams of creatures that were dead and yet not, men and women whose hearts beat no more, and yet who moved all the same. There were other creatures amongst them too. Animals and things even worse than they. Creatures carved from ice, with eyes bluer than the bluest of skies, and one that looked his way, and that Ned swore wore a smile on his face. When he woke it was early, and yet he left his room and walked around the empty yard. He enjoyed the silence and the peace of it, and was lost in his thoughts when the horn rang out. One blow of it, which meant rangers returning. Only this blast came from the watchers on the gates, and not the wall, and it wasn't a ranger's arrival that they announced. Who is it? He was asked by Rickard Karstark. The man like him had not able to sleep and had come running when he heard the horn and saw him standing in the yard. I don't know, he said, as honestly as he could, as they both moved to the gates. The Shadow Tower 301 AC. Iben Targaryen. It had been almost a lifetime ago since he'd made a visit to the Shadow Tower. Just like then, he had looked the same as he did now, and he almost laughed at the whimsy of the gods. For more than 60 years, he'd been the Maester at Castle Black. He'd met almost every commander of the Shadow Tower in that time, and though it was not far away, one visit was all he made. Was there anyone still alive from those days then? They'd think they were seeing a ghost, but as old as Sir Jaime Lannister was, he had not been there when Aemon had last come. Perhaps he was giving them too much credit too, as despite how he looked it wasn't him that attention was focused on. But Sandorix, as the dragon landed, the Black brothers almost as relieved as they were wary to see a dragon in their midst. He climbed down off his dragon's back and told him to rest. They'd soon be flying once more when he escorted Lord Cavan and the Westerland's men to where they needed to be. Aemon traveled without a guard, much to his niece's annoyance, and despite the offer of one from her and his nephew, both he and Shiera had refused. Other than now and long before the fight was to come, he'd not be on the ground or off his dragon's back. So when Jane Sierras had said that perhaps he needed a guard for then, he'd laughed and told him that these men had been his brothers once. If he couldn't count on them to see him safe before the fighting had begun, then they were all doomed. When it did so, reluctantly, his nephew had agreed and then convinced his niece to do likewise, and Aemon could only imagine that Shiera put forward an even better case than he. Prince Aemon, Sir Danes, and the half-hand await you inside, the young man said as he looked past him to where Sandorix rested in the snow. Lead the way, young man, Aemon said as he followed behind him. There was no formality to be faced with, no welcoming committee other than the young man and two more of his men as they led him into the grounds of the Shadow Tower. It hadn't changed much from how he'd remembered it either, other than the men themselves looked happier somewhat. As he was led into Sir Daenerys' solar, he could begin to see and feel the why of it. Castle Black had been falling apart around them, and the Shadow Tower, though better made, had no doubt been in even worse shape. With his nephews and Lord Yami's help, work had been done, and though still lesser than what it should be, it was far better than it had been, even on that day he had come here more than 60 years ago. Some ale food? Sir Daenerys asked as Aemon took a seat in a rather warm room. I've eaten, but I'll take an ale, he said, and the half-hand nodded to one of the men to fetch him one. Is it just yourself that's coming, Aemon? Sir Daenerys asked, and Aemon found himself almost chuckling at both the put-out way he did so and the expression on his face as he looked at him. 35 years the Shadow Tower had been under Sir Daenerys' command, and while Aemon had only visited here once, Sir Daenerys had visited Castle Black many times during that time. He'd spoken to the man on each of those visits, taken note of the needs that he spoke to him about, and then wasted his time sending requests for those needs to be met. Looking around him, it was clear those requests had been answered far more regularly since Jane Harris became king than they had ever been before then. Lord Cavan and the Westerland's fleet should be arriving, and will be leaving some men to guard the ships, and to add to your own. The fight, though, won't be here, or at least not at first, he said to a surprised look from the half-hand. I had thought the bridge, the half-hand asked. His Grace thinks not, and it's to him we take our lead from Castle Black and the Night Fort, and then Eastwatch by the sea, he said, and Denys looked at him curiously. How can he be so certain, Aemon? Daenerys asked, and Aemon smiled. There are things my nephew can do that would blow your mind. Daenerys, I've seen them, and even I don't understand them all. What I know is that we live in a world of magic, and my nephew possesses more of it than any man I know, he said proudly, and then heard the snort from the half-hand. You don't believe me? I believe that you believe, and looking at you sitting there, I can see there is magic at work. But this, knowing where an enemy is going to be before it's there, looking at the wall and thinking that an enemy would march on Castle Black and try to pass it there, when the Bridge of Skulls is a far more true way of crossing over. No. Aemon, I don't believe you, the half-hand said. It matters not, for it's not Jackal, Warren, or I that are in command. My men will stay here, Yansamin, and will welcome those you bring to bear, though I wish your dragon was staying too. Denys said with a cough. My nephew will be coming here before the week is over, Denys. There is a reason why this is not where the fight will be. But that reason hasn't happened yet, he said as both men looked at him with looks of disbelief. He wished he could tell them, let them know what it was that Jacob Harris had planned, but his nephew had been clear that he could not. Just as Jacob could see the Night King in his moves, so too could he see some of their own, other than those hidden away in the mind of dragons, that was. Aemon asked for and received some food for Sandorix, Not enough to feed the dragon for true, but it would put something in his belly. Then, after saying his goodbyes to Ser Daenerys and the half-hand, it was back on Sandorix's back, and they headed out to sea. Once he'd seen the ships in the distance, he told Sandorix that it was time to feed, as it would be a little while before he could hunt again. The whale was small, but it was enough for now, and as Sandorix ate his fill, Aemon waited on the shore for the first of the ships to arrive. He didn't have too long to wait, and it was Lord Brax and his men that he welcomed, and their smiles at seeing Sandorix and himself were true ones. Tyrion had flown in the war with the men of the West, and they knew what it meant to have a dragon to call upon. Since his nephew would escort the men of Dorne this time around, Aemon had offered to escort the men of the West. By nightfall, Lord Kevin himself had arrived, and Aemon welcomed being able to stay in the pinnacle ship rather than in the tents and out in the cold air. He knew the men of the West had been prepared far better than most, both his nephew and Lord Jaime having seen to that. Aemon also knew that the cold of the north was a hard thing to get used to, even for a man like he who'd spent most of his life here. The food was most welcome, and the comfort of the cabin provided him with the best night's sleep he'd had since he left King's Landing. Yet it was the night's conversation that he'd enjoyed most of all. "How do men live in such a place?" Sir Adam Marbrand asked. "Men are resilient, and not all are lucky enough to grow up in the sun," Kevin said, and Aemon chuckled. "And some of those who did found themselves here anyway." Lord Brax said as the laughter rang out. "Prince Aemon, these daggers and spears, do you really think they more suitable to the fight to come than my axe?" The Strongboar asked, and it wasn't only his eyes that looked his way. "His grace does, he Sir Lorzias. Sir Arthur and Prince Oberyn fought these things we'll face. Sir Lorzier." When he came back from beyond the wall, he was even keener that all men would carry dragonglass. Knives, spears, arrowheads, hammers, axes, eye-axes, he said. When the Strongboar looked at him, "I'll see you're given one, since it seems your weapon of choice," he said to loud laughs. "I thank you, my prince, and I meant his grace, no disrespect." The Strongboar said, though he didn't need to, "It's no disrespect to question, Sir Lyle. My nephew wouldn't see it as such, and neither do I. Fire, dragonglass, and dragon steel. That's what it requires to end that we face, and that's what we've been given. For those who can use them, we have spears tipped with dragonglass or dragon steel. His grace wields Dark Sister, and, from what I've been told, Lord Jaime carries black fire." Aemon said to surprised looks on all the faces other than Lord Kevin's, the man, knowing how important his nephew was to Aemon's own. "And we have the dragons for the fire," he said to some banging of mugs on the table. "To the dragons," the Strongboar shouted. "Aye, to the dragons," Lord Kevin added. He woke up the next morning with a headache, and yet felt as good as he had in years, and over the next 3 days, more than 20,000 men landed and began to march. Aemon waited until the last of them did so before he took to the sky. As he flew, he looked to the wall and felt Sandorix's reluctance to even contemplate flying over or around it. He'd thought that his dragon would do so, since they were so close to the edge. But instead, he'd needed to be led across the Bridge of Skulls on a horse's back, rather than on a dragon's. As he'd stood on the bridge and looked to the vast lands beyond it, with the abandoned castle of Westwatch by the bridge behind him, he'd felt his own fears and doubts begin to rise. Whether it was the feeling that he was being watched, the thoughts of what exactly it was that was out there and moving their way, or knowing that something was stopping Sandorix from being here, he couldn't tell. What he could was that when he'd ridden back and was back on Sandorix's back and flying away from rather than to the wall, it was only then that his fears began to fade. Eastwatch by the sea, 301 AC, Lozias. It was different, felt different being with Garen than it had when he'd lain with Satin. Whether it was because the prince was far more experienced than either he or Satin had been, or that he was feeling a deeper connection with him that he had with his first love, was hard to tell. All he could be sure of was that each night they'd sailed and shared a bed had been a night he'd remember for as long as he lived. He'd wake in the morning and find that his eyes were drawn to the man beside him, his fingers lightly caressing his face of his chest, and as Loras closed his eyes, he was still able to see what Garen looked like even after he'd done so. J.A. had told him often of how he felt about Mark Ellery. He'd spoken of her in a way that were they any other two people in the world, then Loras would have felt jealous of them both. Only that it was his closest ever friend and his sister had it allowed for him to be happy for them both. Happy and not sad that he did not have that in his life, and that the chance he'd thought of ever having it had gone and left him all alone. Now, though, he felt it too, more keenly than he'd ever felt before, and it made him love his friend even more, knowing that Jay felt that way about Mark Ellery. "You're doing it again," Garen's voice said, and Loras looked at him confused as his love's eyes were open, when just a moment before they'd been closed. "Doing what?" he asked to a chuckle from Garen, as he moved his hands to Loras's mouth. "That smiling thing I like so much," Garen said, and Loras laughed as he shook his head. "You would deny me my happiness?" he asked, pretending to be put out. "Never," Garen said, and Loras felt a lump in his throat at the words and the looks that Garen was giving him. I love you," he said almost shakily, half expecting to hear a laugh or no words at all. "I love you too," Garen said, and a moment later, he was kissing him, his tongue touching his own, and were it not for that, then Loras would have shouted out in joy. As much as he would have liked to stay in bed, though, he knew they could not. So very reluctantly, he moved away and began to dress, only for Garen to move with him and make a game out of not giving him his clothing. By the time they were done, he'd been awake an hour and Eastwatch was coming into view. So strapping Rhaegar to his hip, Loras looked at Garen, and with a nod, they both walked to the deck. Garen had surprised him with the sword on their first night at sea, and Loras really should have expected it knowing Jay and how he did. When Jay hadn't given him a weapon that could defeat the dead, he'd not thought too much on it, or at least not until Garen's ship had set sail. He was ashamed now to admit that once he had, he'd felt a little annoyed at his friend. True, he knew that he'd given Blackfire to Jaime, and he'd not begrudged the man who meant so much to them both wielding a Valyrian steel sword. It was, however, the thoughts that he'd not sought protection for him, or had perhaps not cared to, that had begun to take hold in Loras's mind. Which was when Garen had called him to his rooms and presented him with a Valyrian steel sword that was to be his and his alone. "Our king wished to have a sword made for you. I believe he actually had already done so, other than the hilt. I asked him to allow me to gift you one instead." When Garen had told him that and handed him the sword, Loras hadn't, and perhaps still wasn't sure, who'd he'd been more grateful to. James for not forgetting about him, and for caring enough to make a sword for him, and for then allowing Garen to gift him so, or Garen for giving him a sword that he'd since found out had been in his family for generations. It was only that he himself wielded a spear that had allowed Loras to accept it. As soon enough, his worry had been that it would be Garen who was unprotected. He then practiced with it every day, not hitting it against anything, but just getting used to the feel of the sword in his hands. That Garen sat and watched him as he did so gave him another excuse to stand on the deck and swing Rhaegar against opponents that weren't there. "Eat," Garen said, taking him from his thoughts, and Loras took the plate off him. The two of them sitting on the bow as they ship pulled into the docks at Eastwatch. They had passed countless other ships on their journey. Loras amazed by just how many had set out to sea, and he was sure that more men marched in this army than had marched to see Jane crowned. He also knew that not all had marched, and men like Girion and others had been refused permission to do so. Jay making plans just in case the worst came to pass. Knowing what was coming for them, he was relieved that they were taking such precautions. The thoughts of them falling here and what that would mean to those left behind were not ones he wished to dwell upon. Jay had made arrangements for Margaery and Alia, for Joy, Sansa, and Willas, and for his grandmother, mother, and father to set sail if need be. The Lannisters, Starks, Tyrells, Martells, all of those that Jay considered family would be in the first ships, and Garen would see them housed in Troyen if needed. So he knew they would be safe, or as safe as you can be when the dead marched. It left the rest of those he cared about to face the danger. Jay and Garen, who would march with the Reach forces, and Garen now, too, that he'd be by his love's side and not by his king's, was both welcome and not. Though he knew that as with everything Jay did, this had a reason to it, and in time that reason would be made much more clear. "Now you're doing the thing I dislike," Garen said, and Loras smirked as he looked at him. "Maybe you need to turn my frown upside down," he asked cheekily, and Garen chuckled. "Here? Really? Do you not think that would be too much for the Black Brothers to bear?" Garen said, and Loras laughed loudly as Garen pointed to the men waiting on the docks for them. "Perhaps we should wait then," he said with a smirk. If he didn't know the truth of Prince Garen, then he'd be certain that he was Oberyn's long-lost twin. Not only because of how he looked, but how he acted at times too. He had a cheeky way of doing things. An irreverence about him that was refreshing, and Loras wondered how his grandmother would take to him when she found out about them both. Marjorie already knew. His sister knowing before he ever did, no doubt. G.A. knew too, and his friend was as supportive as he had ever been. Finishing the meal, he handed the plate off to one of the men, and then he and Garen ready to disembark. This would be their base, the Rhonish wouldn't be marching to Castle Black, and instead, they'd both protect the ships in case they were needed to evacuate the free folk and those of the north, and they would fight the dead when they came their way. By the sea was where they would be best placed to stop the army that marched their way. Garin telling him that water magic was just as powerful as the magic the Night King could wield. "Please, by the Seven, make it so," he said softly as they walked towards the Black Brothers that seemed happy to greet them. The night Fort Surrey 1 AC, Gorlan Tyrell. He had expected to be left behind again, when news came to him that Tarly was training men for the fight to come. Garland had been sure that he'd be left in Highgarden once more, so he'd sent word to Jax and practically begged to be given leave to march. How that had gone down with his family he couldn't tell, but it had not gone down well with Leonette. When the Raven arrived, bidding him train his own men and letting him know that he could, if he so wished, march, she'd then stopped speaking to him for days. Nothing he had said to her was accepted, and his reasoning for why he had to march was just simply dismissed. Part of that was down to the fact that she was with child, and she wished him there when she gave birth. A larger part down to the worry she felt about the danger he would be in while at the Wall. Lures had not been shy in telling their grandmother about what it was he and J.A. had faced. Beyond the Wall, after which his grandmother had not been shy in telling Losiat the truth of it, once Garland had requested to lead his men there, he knew the danger, the risks, and that this would be a fight unlike any other. He also knew that his family would be fighting there. Both Jay and Loras would be risking their lives. Losiat's brother, his good brother, would march, as would Ser Jon Fossaway, and men he had always named as friends. It would be shameful for him not to, for a Tyrell not to lead and allow a Tyrelly to do so. True enough, he wished for the glory that he'd not gained during the War of the One True King, the acclaim that he, as a warrior, felt was his due. There was more to his wish to march than that, though. The fight to come was not just a fight for the ages. It was a fight for every man, woman, and child in Westeros. A fight for Leonette and their babe, and for Margaery and his niece, for his mother and father and his grandmother, for everyone that he knew and loved. Eventually, he managed to get that through to Leonette, and despite her own feelings and worries, she gave him her favor and told him to come home safely. After they'd said their goodbyes, and while she had traveled to King's Landing to be with the rest of his family, Garland had marched to Old Town and joined the other Lords of the Reach. Command was to be split between him, Randall Tarly, and Matthias Rowan, with Paxter Redwine in charge of transport and of the ships themselves, once they had reached the Bay of Ice. The journey to Old Town was one that was spent in Tarly's annoying company, and laughing with men he named his friends. After they had arrived in the north, he did at least see moments of respect in Randall's eyes when he looked his way. Something that only made his need to be here more apparent. Tarly only respected warriors and men he'd bled beside, and Garland was sure they would all bleed in the war to come. "He's still a miserable fucker," Ser Jon Fossaway said to him as Randall and Matthias took their leave and went back to their tents. "That he is. Thank the Seven we don't have him with us for his humor." Garland said to a loud laugh from his good uncle. "True be that," Ser Jon said. "I've never known cold such as this," Garland said, shivering despite the furs. "You think that's why the king had us leave the ships so far from the Wall, so that we'd get used to the north?" Ser Jon asked, and Garland found himself contemplating that. Their orders had awaited them at Old Town along with their ships. They were to sail to Deepwood Mott, where they would be met by some of the northern forces, and then to march with them to the Night Fort. It would take them more than a month to do so, and they'd already been marching for close to 3 weeks. The cold air and harsh conditions of the north already costing more than one man a toe or a finger, and one or two their lives as they struggled to get used to them. Even those like him, who'd done as he'd been bid, had found it tough going, though he had found himself able to do more this last week than he had the previous 2. "I think it's part of it," he said, realizing he'd been silent for a few moments. "There's also the ships themselves, as the young lad, Lawrence was it?" he asked, and Ser Jon nodded. "As Lawrence said, our ships are to remain in case there is a need to evacuate the north." Gorlan said, and he could see the worried look on Ser Jon's face, "I'd still have thought it for the best for them to be closer to the Wall." Ser Jon said, "The West's ships will take up all the space, further along the Rhonish, Dorne's, and the King's Own, all along the eastern shores. I get the feeling that our ships in the West combined leave no room for a free dock anywhere along the western coast, and that's not even counting the Ironborn Jon," Garland said. "Fucking Reavers, you think we can trust them to guard our back? Jon said, his voice bitter as he'd never liked the Ironborn. The king does, and who am I to gainsay him, he said with a chuckle. The dragon joined them the next day, and when he saw that it was the green and bronze one, he saw the surprise on the faces of the men with him. They were more than pleased to have a dragon with them, and they knew that Prince Affan was with the men of the West, and Prince Tyrion with the men of Dorne. Garland suspected that some of them had hoped it would be the king himself who was by their own side, but there wasn't a man among them who dare name Princess Shiera a second choice. Sir Garland, Lord Tarley, Lord Rowan, the princess said as she dismounted the green dragon, as if it were no more than a pony. Garland watching as Riel took to the air and flew off a little to the south of them. Princess, it's an honor to have you with us, he said with a warm smile. I only wish it was for a different reason, Sir Garland. Shiera said softly, my niece has arrived at Eastwatch and Princes Aemon and Tyrion march with their own men. We're perhaps 4 days' march from the Night Fort, and His Grace has left men there to help make it more accommodating. Though other than sleep, it's for the best if we don't dwell in that accursed place. Shiera said. The expression on her face was not one that he could discern. You'll march with us, my princess? Matthias asked, and Garland was surprised at the warm smile that appeared on her face. I'm a dragon, Lord Rowan, and dragons belong in the sky. Rosierkill and I will protect you from there and stay by your side when we reach the Night Fort. Yakel and I will protect you from there and stay by your side when we reach the Night Fort. Shiera said almost jokingly. His Grace, Randyll asked, has his own tasks to do, but I've no doubt that he'll join us not long after we reach the Night Fort itself. Shiera said to a brisk nod from Randyll. They actually made it in 3 and not 4 days, and as soon as he saw the Night Fort, he could see why Shiera had named it. How she had. So dark and imposing was it, and with such an air of something that he couldn't quite name, that he and a lot of the men refused to settle in its halls. Unsurprisingly, Tarley dismissed their concerns as silly and took up residence inside the walls, as did some of the men who put their warmth over the eeriness of the place. Garland, though, felt he'd made the right choice when Princess Shiera herself took a tent rather than a room, and even more so a couple of days after they'd arrived, when so did the king. Castle Black 301 AC. Jaime. The march itself had been easy enough, though given he rode with less than 1,000 men perhaps, that was the reason for it. He passed far larger forces of men, and even Tyrion and Oberyn as he marched, and he came very close to slowing down and marching with his brother and the Dornish before thinking the better of it. Jaime knew he'd see them all soon enough, and he was eager to get to Castle Black and to see Jay once again. Other than when they'd spoken as he departed, King's Landing, he'd not seen his king in more than a moon, and he found he missed him, both him and Loras. Though it would be even longer until he saw Loras again. He also had a need to get the Westermen ready for what they were to face. Caven could lead them to the wall, but he was their commander, and needed to be seen to be so by them. If he timed it right, he'd arrive at Castle Black before they did, and it would show them the wisdom of his choice to leave from King's Landing, rather than from Casterly Rock. When he finally saw the walls of the castle come into view, it stirred up memories of his last visit here. He could hardly believe it was now almost 7 years ago, nor how his life had changed since then, and how the visit here in some ways was a large catalyst for that change. It had been coming here that had brought him a wife and 2 children, here that had set in motion the events which had brought the realm a good and true king. That visit had alleviated fears that he'd had about his king and the strangeness of the things he could do. So as he rode in through the gates of Castle Black, he did so wearing a true and full smile. Lord Yaxley, we had not expected you so soon. Ned Stark said as he greeted him after he and his men had dismounted. Nor I, is his grace here? He asked eagerly. No, we received a raven from my brother Benjen at Queen's Crown, telling us he'd met with them, and then another from Last Heart saying he had arrived there. Apparently, my nephew has decided to attend a wedding, Ned said with a small smirk on his face. Who's getting married? He asked. Not sure if he'd heard the man right. The Small John and Rosleen Frey, Benjen's note said that James Sirius arrived to escort the Frey folk to the wall and to make sure that those who weren't to march knew what it was they were to do, and then he flew on to Last Hearth to attend the Small John's wedding. Ned said, his smirk fuller now. I believe he feels he owes them both. Jaime said, and Ned nodded. Aye, come. I'm sure some warm food and cider will be more than welcome. We've set aside rooms for you and James Sirius in the King's Tower. Ned said, and Jaime turned to Arlan and Pharaoh to tell them to see the men were settled and fed. As they walked up the steps, he saw men training under the watchful eye of Jaime's cousins Robb and Cregan, and some men he'd not seen before. He looked at them, trying to name them, and was noticed by Ned, who told him who they were. The Company of the Rose. They arrived a couple of days before you. Gods, even knowing they were back in the north, hadn't prepared me for actually meeting the men. Ned said, shaking his head. Jag used them to protect his aunt and sent them a message about the fight to come. He spoke to me about a prophecy they have. Something about the White Wolf calling them back to the north, he said, not truly remembering exactly what it was that Jay had said, which, considering there was more than one prophecy relating to his king, was no great surprise. The White Wolf will howl and we will follow, for he is the prince that is promised, and only together can we bring the dawn, Ned said, almost reverently. Never simple are they, he said with a loud laugh. These prophecies, they never just say what they mean, he added, when Ned looked at him confusedly. I think this one was simple enough, and I thank the old gods that Jay found Ghost, Ned said, and Jaime nodded. He stepped into the Lord Commander's rooms to find a man who could be only northern Stannis Baratheon. Jeor and Rickard Korstak, all speaking animatedly. Only when they saw that Ned wasn't alone did the words stop, and Jeor rose to his feet to greet him. Lord Jaime, it's good to see you again. Jaeger said, his greeting warm and true. Aye, you too, Lord Mormont. Though would you hold it against me if I said I'd rather we'd not be meeting now, he said to laughs. Given what we're to face, I doubt there is a man in this room who would, Rickard Korstak said, as Jaime shook his hand, and then took his seat. Here, get this into you. No doubt the road's been about as kind as it always is, Jarg said as he poured him a mug of something steaming, Jaime enjoying the warmth and the taste of the cider as he took his first swallow. Perhaps you can talk some sense into touring here. Jaime, J.R. said almost exasperatedly. J.R.? he asked confusedly. The company wished to travel beyond the wall and to scout for the army of the dead. Torrhen Snow said to a derisive snort from Stannis Baratheon. Then the company will be no more, Jaime said, and Torrhen looked at him angrily. He knew then the argument that was going to come, and that hand of the king or not, he'd be told that he had no right to tell the men of the Company of the Rose what they could or could not do. Only Jay could do so, and only he would. They listened, Jaime almost smirking when he heard the sound of the dragon, as she landed and wondering if the old gods had decided for his king to arrive just at that moment. Or was Jay's own timing just that damn good? The king's here, father, Robb Stark said excitedly as he almost burst into the room. You can take it up with his grace, Turin. See for yourself why it is, he asked me and my men not to range beyond the wall for more than a year or two. Zora said, almost sounding like a man who'd won an argument that he was long tired of. Aye, I'll speak to the king, Torrhen said with a nod. With one last swallow of the hot cider, he joined the others as they made their way to the courtyard. He could see Rosiax towering over the gates, which were now opening to allow Jay, Arthur, and Jars inside, and they reached the courtyard just as he did. Jaime taking to his knee, just as everyone else did, and he was happy to see the smile that Jay wore on his face as he approached them. By the old gods, is that? He heard Ned Stark ask, and Torrhen Snow replied almost proudly. The crown of the kings of winter, the crown of Torrhen Stark. Torrhen Snow said as Jaime looked to the crown of iron and bronze. Castle Black is yours, your grace, Jader said as Jade stood in front of them. I thank you, Lord Commander. Rise all of you. There is much work still to be done. Jack said firmly, and Jaime saw the small nod he gave him when he rose, and he was glad he'd hurried to make it here in time. Castle Black 301 AC, Jacrius Targaryen. He'd flown through the north and watched as men had marched from every land in the Seven Kingdoms. All in all, he had more than 100,000 men to call upon, with perhaps close to another 50,000 spread around in reserves and for protection for those who lived in the north. Should his own army fall, then those men would see that the people made it to the ships and took to the seas. Almost every animal that he'd warged into over the many years would play their parts too. Here in the north, in King's Landing, High Garden, Old Town, Lannisport, and Casterly Rock, from Storm's End to Sunspear, people would wait and do what his birds and other familiars bid them to. Would it come to that? Would he need to evacuate the entire Seven Kingdoms? If so, would he be able to do so, should he himself fall? Time and time again, he'd asked himself those questions, and the best answer he could come up with was that he would see it done. Should it come to pass then with all he had left, he'd see it done, and buy the people as much time as he could give them. He was under no illusions that he'd be able to save them, that if he fell to the Night King, those he cared about would somehow live in peace. In time, the magic that the Night King possessed would bring the entire world of Planetas under his control, and all life would end. Jaehaerys often found himself remembering something that his uncle Jaime and Lady Olenna would say to him as he got closer to his throne. When you play the Game of Thrones and you win or you die, there is no middle ground. This was no game, but the words were perhaps even more true here and now. And it wasn't just his life that was at stake. Everyone that he cared about, from the people who had put their faith in their king to protect them, to his friends who meant so very much to him, to his kin on both sides, to those he'd left behind, hoping to keep them from harm or to at least buy them an extra day, week, moon, or year in this world. His wife, his daughter, God's the thoughts of not seeing them again were only kept from his head by his determination to do just that. I will hold Axiel in my arms and see her grow. I will feel my wife's lips on mine own once more. I will see my family again, those I've left behind, and those I lost. I swear it on the old gods. On Rislor, and on the 7 who are one. I swear it on fire and blood. Each night he would go to sleep repeating those words over and over until his eyes closed. What Arthur or Jaehaerys must think of him, he could only guess. Though he always said the words softly, and perhaps they sounded more like mumbles than anything else. He had been happy to see Benjen and Frost again when Rhaenys had landed in Queen's Crown. Seeing his uncle be so at peace and so content had almost made him demand that Benjen stay behind with Val and ensure the free folk followed his orders to move and run, if the need arose. If he believed for even a moment that he'd accept it, then he'd have given the order, but he knew he would not. Instead, he'd watched as Benjen, Val Tormund, and Mance had said their goodbyes, and as the free folk marched into a fight, better prepared and better equipped than the last one. He hoped it was enough, and that he'd done enough. He prayed it was. What made him fly to Last Hearth he knew not, but fly there he did, and arrived to find he was just in time for a wedding. The Great Jon was more than pleased to see him, and even more so that Ghost was in King's Landing, and not with him or part of the army that awaited them at the wall. Though he did get the feeling, he was also far more disappointed about that absence than he let on. The wedding had been a boon to his soul, and he'd wished the bride and groom well, and even offered the Smaljin leave to travel with his bride. That part he'd done in private so as to get the man's true feelings and not to allow his bravado to be his guide. The answer he received was one that he knew would bring a smile to his face whenever he thought about it in the days to come. An answer that only the Smaljin would have been able to give. You think I'd let dead men march in the north, Jay? That I'd pass up the chance to fight in such a fight? I tell you what I'll do. This axe, this dragonglass axe that I'm meant to wield, I'm going to take it and shove it right up the Night King's icy cold arse. Who's next to face Goatsbane? The small John shouted, and Jay was happy that he was on their side. He'd left before the Umbers had marched and had promised Rosine he'd do all he could to bring her husband back to her. It was a promise he'd do his best to keep, but he had made so many promises that he knew not all would be possible for him to do so. When they arrived finally at Castle Black, he was happy to see Jaime there, to see Robin Cregan, and to speak to his Uncle Ned. He hoped he'd have some time with them all before the fight was upon them. After bidding them rise, he walked with them to the Lord Commander's rooms, his cousins, his uncle, his father by choice, all of them looking more to the crown than to him. Torren found it buried some miles from here. It seems that Akken never took it with him after King Torren knelt, he said before the question could be asked. It looks good on you, your grace, his uncle said, and Jay smiled at him. It's the only crown I could wear in the battles to come, uncle. As Jangen's crown is not for this place, or for this fight. It was King of Winter and a king beyond the wall that turned back the original Night's King. Brandon the Breaker and Joramun beat him back, and there is power in this crown. I feel it, though what that power is, I know not, he said to Confused. Looks as they entered the room. It didn't take too long for him to find out that there had been an argument of sorts going on for the last few days. Torren wished to travel beyond the wall and scout the enemy, perhaps even to attack them as if they were a common foe. With a nod to Jars, he waited while his Kingsguard ran to gather his things, and a few moments later, Jars came running back into the room, carrying the chest. All eyes looked eagerly towards it, and when he opened it and took out the glass candles, he could see the surprise on Torren's face. I had hoped not to have to do this until the men of the West and Dorne arrived. I'd not seek to waste it on just the men in this room. No offense to you all, he said to Chuckles. Lord Commander, gather the senior men of the Watch, uncle, cousins, the northern lords, Torren, your commanders, if you will. Have them brought to the common hall. he said, and all but Jaime left the room. You seem tired, Jay. Yaxie, Jaime said softly. I am. It's not lack of sleep, though, so you're not sending me to bed, he said to a laugh from Jaime and his Kingsguard. Then what is on your mind? Yaxed a few moments later. We'll speak later. Come, we'd better show them what it is they're soon to face, he said, as he walked from the room. Jaime, Jurs, and Arthur beside him as he did so. The Trident 2 BC, Torrhen Stark. He had marched and marched hard, bringing with him the largest army the North had ever assembled. More than 30,000 men had crossed through the neck, and it had all been for nothing. As he sat in his tent and pondered his next move, he sighed when his brother came in. Torrhen already knew what Brandon would say before he did so. Still, he sat and he listened, and though he sighed and made his displeasure clear, his brother still spoke fervently about his plans and how they would work. Our bows are strong, brother. We can take them down, and without them, they are nothing, Brandon said, almost laughing as he did so. And what of their men? He asked, looking to his brother. They're no match for our own, and some will abandon the dragons once their beasts have been slain. Brandon said, and if they should not, if they hold and stand firm, then we face an arm larger than our own, one with far more horse and far better armored, he said, trying to get it through to his brother. It wasn't just the dragons that he feared, though fear them he did. Southern men, not Northmen, not men like our own. We can beat them, brother. Without their beasts, we can beat them. Brandon said, willing him to accept his words. What if you fail, brother? What if one dragon escapes, or all are not there? You heard what Balerion did to Harrenhal and what they did to the Lannisters and the Gardeners on the field of fire. Am I to risk the lives of our men on a plan that may not work? He asked almost angrily. What's the alternative, brother? Kneel and beg for scraps from the dragon's table. Is it a wolf you are, or is there mouse blood in your veins? Brandon said, and Torrhen's fist caught his brother's cheek hard as he knocked him to the ground. You doubt me, a wolf? He asked with a snarl. His brother looked at him and spit the blood out of his mouth before rising to his feet, a small smile on his face as he did so. I just wanted to make sure that the wolf was still inside you. Tell me what you wish of me. Brandon asked. Go and speak to Aegon Targaryen, seek him out, and see what he offers. I'll not spill more northern blood than I need to, he said, and Brandon nodded before turning to leave. Take your guards with you. Have them dress up in the maester's robes, he said to a chuckle from Brandon as he left. It took him some time to return, and the note he brought back with him was not the one he'd expected. Torrhen looking at it and then handing it to Brandon, who seemed just as surprised as he was. This can't be true, Brandon said after reading it. No, but it's a strange lie to make up, though, is it not? What thought you of the man himself? He asked curiously. A warrior who is both fierce and focused. This is not a man who offers terms lightly, and yet he seemed... Brandon? He asked, looking to his brother, who had drifted off in his thoughts somewhat. Brandon? He said a little more loudly. What? Sorry. He seemed to almost be expecting me. I mean, he said something I thought was odd at the time, though now I'm not so sure, Brandon said, and Torrhen looked at him. What did he say? He asked, eager to learn as much about the dragon as he could before deciding his next move. Emma Maesters would be more at home with a sword in their hands than a book, Brandon said, and Torrhen smirked. Aegon had either seen through his ruse or had simply been sure it was to come, either of which gave him pause and concern. Send a note and arrange a meeting, just you, me, and him, Brandon, and with guest rights to be offered and accepted, he said, and Brandon nodded before leaving him alone. Torrhen opening the note and reading it once more. Wolves and dragons should howl together, for in time our kin will bring the dawn. It took 4 more notes before he was able to make his way with his brother to meet with Aegon Targaryen. The meeting to be held far too close to the dragon's lair for Torrhen's liking. While he'd conceded that guest rights would be acceptable, Aegon had only agreed to his dragon leaving once they'd all partook. As he and Brandon made their way to the meeting place, they could see the dragon in the distance, or the shape of it, at least. Balerion was as dark as the night sky, and it was only that he moved, or else he'd have been invisible to the eye. Brandon may think his weirwood bows and arrows a match for a beast that size. Torrhen was far less convinced. Just as he was not sold on the notion that the army that Aegon had at his back would be as easy to defeat as his brother assumed. True enough, he could retreat to the moat and hold them back. But then what? What was his next move, and what if just one of his brother's arrows missed, or if he was proved more right than Brandon? We've come to treat at your request, he said, when they arrived, and Aegon smiled as he took some of the bread and salt from a plate he held in his hands, before offering some to him and to Brandon. "The dragon," Brandon said, and Torrhen looked on with interest as Aegon turned to the dragon. "Savagon Nayot Oha Mandia, Belerion. Fly to your sisters, Belerion," Aegon said, and the true size of the dragon was then revealed, even Brandon beginning to doubt his plans as it took to the air. He looked to the man in front of him. His silver hair was cut short, and his purple eyes were barely able to be seen in the darkness. Aegon wore a shirt of black scales and a silver circlet with square-cut rubies on his head. His sword that he carried on his hip was one of Valyrian steel, just like ice. Though Blackfire was a longsword, where ice was a great one, of a height and size with both Brandon and himself, Aegon, he could see, was powerfully built. The man was a warrior through and through, and for that reason alone he demanded and had his respect. "Your words were not the ones I expected," Torrhen said. "Your march was not the one I did either," Aegon replied. "You thought we'd stay north of the neck while you conquered all the land south of it?" Brandon asked. "I hoped you would," Yak said, with a sigh. "I've no quarrels with House Stark, no more than the present circumstances demand. I had intended to come to you once my war was done, but here we find ourselves, and here an accord must be reached." Yak said, looking directly at him, and not at Brandon. "What accord is that?" he asked as he stared at Aegon. "House Stark will kneel and give up its crown, and once it has, I'll name you, and then your heirs after you as Wardens of the North and Lords of Winterfell. I'll leave the North mainly to its own devices, and not ask more of it than it's willing to give," Aegon said, and again Brandon answered, instead of him. "You offer us no more than is already ours by right and seek far more in return. Why would we contemplate such a thing?" Brandon asked. "Daenerys dreamed, and so we came. And in doing so, we escaped the doom that took our lands from us." Aegon said, "Yet our coming was not without purpose. In time a war will come that you and I will not be here to fight. A war that only a son with both our blood running through his veins can win. When that war comes, I know not who that son will be. I know that he is the prince that is promised. The Song of Ice and Fire, the White Wolf, and the Winter Dragon. I know little more than that." Aegon said as Brandon snorted. "Why should I believe anything you say?" Torrhen asked. "It's not only me who's here to say it." Axe said, and Torrhen and Brandon both dropped to a knee when they saw him come from behind the tree, his height, size, and the antlers he wore marking him for who he was. "The dragon speaks true, and all of you have your roles to play. Yours takes you far from here, Brandon Snow. Yours will make your fellow Northern think less of you, Torrhen Stark, and yours will cost your family much blood, Aegon Targaryen. The prince must come, and should you not agree to terms then, he will not. The North, South, East, and the West. All that you love and all you know will end, and that end shall be on your heads, and not mine own." The old god said before he moved away, and in the blink of an eye he was gone. Tyrion looked to Brandon, who nodded, and then they followed Aegon to his tent. A mummery was to be done on the morrow, one of a far more public kneeling and a fight between brothers leading in exile. He'd give up his crown, only for it to be returned in secret, accept his bannerman's scorn, and in many years from now, when he'd die, he'd know not if what he had done was for true or not. It was a heavy price to pay, but it was one that all three of them were willing to do so. So the next morning he crossed the Trident and knelt before a king, and he did so with nary a doubt in his mind. Castle Black now, if not for what he and the rest of those present had just seen, or for Jaime and Arthur catching Jaez as he fell, then Ned Stark would have been far more worried about his nephew than he was. Instead, he, Robb, Cregan, the Northern Lords, the Men of the Watch, and the men of the Company of the Rose had all looked on as the truth of Torrhen Stark had been revealed to them. They'd listened as Aegon had read passages from a book that had then become a prophecy that the Company had waited centuries to be filled. He'd watched on as a crown had been buried that had been thought lost. Also a king could come and claim it 300 years later. When he looked to Jade and saw the blood falling from his nose and the worried looks on Robb's, Cregan's, and others' faces, his own worries had grown. Ned, rushing to where Arthur and Jaime were laying his nephew down on the ground. Will he asked as he held his breath. "Magic takes a toll. He'll be well after he's rested," Jaime said, and Ned felt his relief as if it was a far more palpable thing. "Father, look," Robb said, and he looked to where his son was pointing. The blood from Jane's nose rolling down and being absorbed by the crown that he still wore on his head. "Is that?" Rickard Karstark asked incredulously. Ah, it's glowing, Cregan said, and Ned looked to the crown to see it now shining brightly. Eastwatch by the sea, 31 AC. Dapty. Far below her Aurain sailed with her men, and Dany feared for them all. Even here, high up on Elegon's back, and with the entire expanse of blue sky in front of her, it was the ships that she looked down upon. Almost everyone she cared for in the entire world would be taking part in the battles to come. Sandor, Grey Worm, Bonifer, Balwas, and of course Aurain. Other than her family, who were off dealing with their own duties, and Missandei, who was to remain on Dragonstone, all of them were on the lead ship that she now flew over. She'd sailed part of the way and flown part of it too, her nights spent in her husband's arms and her days in the air as she scouted the lands ahead of them. Dany wished to know as much about them as she could. She was determined to learn where there was water, food, and cover, and where there was not. Elegon would be as prepared for what was to come as she could make her, both for the battle and for a retreat, if it was needed. The more she thought of either, the less she was sure which of them sat the best with her. A retreat would probably keep her husband safe, as Rhaenys was to remain with the ships and to help lead the evacuation if need be. It would take him from the danger of battle, and the heart that feared so very much for him wished him to be far away from here. Yet if they had to retreat, then it meant they were losing, and if they were losing, then all of those she cared about would be even more at risk. She'd already had nightmares of losses that she knew she'd not be able to bear, and so at times it was the battle to come that she wished for more than the retreat, which may well follow. Elegon, Coniar, Elegon. Down there, Elegon, she said, and the dragon took her to the small cove she'd just seen ahead of her. She needed to feel Orany's arms around her, and though there was still much daylight remaining, she needed to feel them now. Denku flew over the ship, and knew that her husband would get her meaning. Elegon then landed in the cove, and within the hour, Orany had led the boat to collect her, and she was now back on board. The dragon's breath. The pinnacle was her own, a gift from her nephew for her wedding, and one that her husband most appreciated, as did Sandor and Belwas, given the comfort that the cabins provided. "I'd not expected you to come back so quickly," Orany said as he took her in his arms once the ship was back at sail. "I missed my husband and we're now close enough to Eastwatch. As it is, we'll arrive on the morrow, or perhaps mid-afternoon," she said, and he nodded with a small smirk on his face. "What?" she asked, playfully. "You take all the fun out of sailing," he said, and she slapped him lightly on the shoulder as they walked down to the cabins below. "I do not," she said, pretending to pout. "I wish to impress my wife with mine own declaration of our arrival, but she and her dragon beat me to it." Orany said, smirking still. "I'm still fun," she said, before she laughed when he lifted her in the air, his kisses telling her far more than his words could have, and letting her know that he thought her so too. She ate that night with those closest to her. Belwas, who looked ridiculous in the extra layers of fur that he wore, even here in the dining cabin where it was warm and Sandor was taking the piss out of him for doing so. Bonifer looked lost in thought, and Orany sat much closer to her than usual, his hands touching her own every so often, and it took her a moment to realize he did so only when she frowned. Her worries were still on her mind, and no matter how much she tried to send them away, they'd not leave until she was laying her bed later that night. Even then, it was only the distractions that her husband's lips and fingers brought to her as he kissed and touched her before they then took their pleasure in each other, and she then fell into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, she broke her fast and called Elegon to meet her at a smaller cove, Erain taking her to her dragon so that she could fly the rest of the way to Eastwatch. Dany knew it was important that the men waiting there could see that they had a dragon to offer them protection from what marched their way. She arrived before they did, and she heard the cheers when she landed. Dany smiling to see Loras and Prince Garin and the Rhonish army that she and Elegon would fight with if the fight came their way. Her nephew had told her it would, yet he'd not ordered the evacuation of the people here as of yet, which was something that concerned her when she saw just how many of them there were. Climbing down off Elegon's back, she took a closer look at her surroundings and saw the rows of tents that seemed to stretch for miles around. "Princess, it's good to see you again," Prince Garin said, and Dany was glad he'd not tried to kiss her hand, the coldness of this place making her not wish to remove the gloves she wore. "You too, Prince Garin. Sir Loras," she said with a nod to the young king's guard, who now looked a far happier man than when last they'd met. "Princess, is Lord Orien to join us?" Loras asked, and Dany smiled at the mention of her husband. "He is. The dragon's breath is not far behind me and should arrive within an hour or two." "How fares things here?" she asked curiously. We've settled in as well as can be expected. My people aren't used to the cold, but they've adapted well. Prince Garen said. And my nephew? She asked curiously. His Grace stopped here before flying on to Castle Black. He arrived before we did so. We didn't get to speak. Prince Tyrion and Prince Oberyn, we did get to speak to, and both seemed well, but we've heard nothing of Prince Amin or Princess Shiar. Lor said, and Dane could see how much it bothered him that he'd not seen Jay since he'd gotten here. I'm sure my nephew will join us before the battles to come. As for my aunt and uncle, they have their own parts to play, Dany said, though she wished to see them both, and hoped that Jane arrived soon to allow her to fly on Elegon to speak to them. Will you be needing quarters, Princess? Sir Loras asked, and Dany shook her head. I think I and those with me will be most comfortable on our ship. You're both welcome to join us, she said, looking to them both and noticing a brief look between them before Prince Garen answered. I think it's for the best if we stay with my people. We may join you for a meal, though, if that's acceptable. I'd like that very much, she said, smiling at them before she walked over to speak to Elegon and told her to find somewhere to eat and rest up. Moiraine arrived a little over an hour later, and after the dragon's breath had docked, he, Sandor, Belwas, Bonifer, and Grey Worm joined her as she walked around and took in more of the camp. The free folk were camped much further from the wall than Prince Garen's men, and she took some comfort in that. If the worst came to pass, then they and the people of the north would have more than 30,000 men and a dragon between them, the wall, and what lay behind it. It was Sandor who surprisingly suggested that they go to the castle and speak to the brothers of the Night's Watch, and she found Cotter Pike and his men were more than happy that she was to be staying nearby, or perhaps more precisely that Elegon was. She asked for and received permission to go to the top of the wall, and though it took her some time to reach it, she found it most worthwhile when she did. Shiadar had already explained to her that Rhaegar had refused to cross it, and she knew that Elegon felt the same. So if she wished to see what lay on the other side, then this was the only way she could do so. Looking out on the white lands below her and at the haunted forest off in the distance, she felt a chill run down her spine. The lands, though beautiful to her eyes, were tarnished somewhat by the knowledge of what was moving unseen through them. Let's go back to the ship, Moiraine said, and Dainty took his hand. Only too happy to do so. Castle Black, 301 AC, Oberyn. The march through the north had been more than an eye-opener for those with him. The Dornish lords and their men quickly finding out that their prince wore the clothes he did because the conditions demanded it. They'd been lucky that they'd not lost people, as some had thought him over-exaggerating the cold, only to find that if anything he had downplayed it. His men even had trouble lighting fires, and though Tyrion had suggested letting Rhaegar do so for them, Oberyn had refused. Your dragon won't always be there for them, so they'll learn or they'll freeze, Oberyn said, and Tyrion nodded. It may have sounded harsh to some, but Oberyn knew the truth of things, and that truth was that if they wished to survive here, then they'd have to adapt. Over the course of the march they had, and by the time they reached Castle Black, he'd have matched them against any of the other men who'd come here. Barring the Northmen and the free folk, that was. He'd enjoyed the march, spending time with his men, speaking to them as they sat around a fire and telling them of the things they'd soon be facing. On this, they at least listened far more truly, as the truth about the cold had earned him even more of their trust. He'd also enjoyed Tyrion's company, even though his good nephew had spent as much time in the air as he had on the ground. He and Bronn both joined him in his missing of Valyria, as they each missed their own wives too. That it was even more of a thing with Tyrion was no true surprise given Aerian's condition, and Oberyn did his best to offer reassurance, wherever he could. They'd stopped off to speak to Garland and the Reach Lords, though they had stayed only a night and that outside of the Night Fort. Durin and the Reach had always had a strained relationship, and given what Durin had tried to do during the war. Now this was even more true. Garland, though, was just as well as was, and while Rendell Tarley and Matthias Rowan were prickly, he was glad to see them both here. Given what marched their way, they'd need all the experience they could bring to bear. Tyrion was pleased to spend time with his aunt, and both Lygaron and Rhaegar seemed happy to meet each other again in this strange land. Yet for Oberyn, it was to reach Castle Black and to see his nephew again that drove him forward. Castle Black, my prince. He heard the call ring out from the Outriders, and within an hour he was riding in through the main gate with Tyrion by his side, and not on his dragon's back, for once. When he saw both Ned Stark and Jaime Lannister, along with the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and some other men that he didn't know, all standing there, with no sign of Jay, it caused him some concern, and he wondered if his nephew was already beyond the wall. He quickly dismounted and almost waved away the welcome as he looked to Jaime and asked him where his nephew was. He's resting. Come, I'll lead you both to him. Jaime said before smiling at Tyrion, who seemed just as happy to see him as Jaime wasn't. What's happened? He asked, as they walked up the steps to the king's tower. Jerry used the glass candles. He wanted to show them all what it is we faced. Only that was not what we saw. Jaime said, and Oberyn was relieved. He couldn't detect any worry in his voice. What did you see? Tyrion asked eagerly. We saw Torrhen Stark and why he knelt. Gods, Tyrion. Aegon planned his conquest with this in mind. Even way back then, he was setting the stage for what's to come. Jaime said, rubbing his hand through his hair. Jaime told us this. He told us all about Daenerys and the Doom. Surely it wasn't that much of a surprise. Tyrion asked, and Jaime shook his head. It's one thing hearing it, Tyrion, to see it, though. I and every lord or high-ranking man of the Watch or Company of the Rose, all of us saw the Conqueror as if he was right there in front of us. We saw Belgerion, Tyrion. We saw Torrhen Stark and Brandon Snow in a plan that was made more than 3 centuries ago. We saw it as if we were there, and then we saw... Jaime said, shaking his head. What? He asked worriedly. You'll see it for yourself. Don't try and touch it. Trust me, it's not pleasant. James said with a small shiver as they reached Yaine's room. Oberyn nodding to Arthur and Jorah, who stood guard outside. Inside the room, his nephew lay in bed with his eyes closed as he slept, and looked as peaceful as a babe. Beside him sat both of Jane's cousins. Yet it wasn't them nor the look on Jane's face that Oberyn or any of them found themselves concentrating on. On his head, Jane wore a crown that was hard to make out. Such was the light that shined from it. It was a light that almost flickered, and one that though they could look at and not need to squint or shield their eyes, it did make them turn away from it after a few moments. How is that? Tyrion asked, and Oberyn thought perhaps that what is that may have been a better question, and it was that question that was answered, and not the one that Tyrion had asked. The crown of Torrhen Stark and the kings of winter, Jackson Craven said, and both Oberyn and Tyrion looked to Jaime, whose nod told them that the boy spoke the truth. Oberyn had known that Jay had the crown, but to be honest, he'd paid it very little mind. Compared to all the things that his nephew had gathered over the years, a crown worn by a northern king mattered very little. His nephew had both the ancestral swords of his house, the Conqueror's crown, Daenerys' journal, glass candles, and dragons. A crown of iron and bronze seemed lesser than all of that. Now as she looked to it and felt his headache grow, he found he wasn't so sure. Soon enough, he began to wonder if this, like so much of the things that Jay had gathered, held an import that he didn't yet understand. He bid Robb and Cregan leave when he'd found out that they'd sat vigil for a number of hours, both boys arguing until he told them that they needed to rest and eat to keep their own strength up. It still took him to tell them that he'd be staying by the bed himself to get them to leave, and once they had, Oberyn took a seat beside the bed. When he was offered some warm soup and cider, he accepted gratefully. Once he was done with both, he then spoke to Jaime, Tyrion, and Ned Stark, who had joined them after his son and nephew had left. How long? He asked. A day and a half. He speaks some at night, some mumbled words. Well, all but 3. Gabbai said, a soft smile on his face. Ghost? Rhaegar. Alia. Oberyn said, and Ned Stark laughed as he nodded. Aye, those are the ones, Ned said as Oberyn reached out to move Jag's hair from his eyes. He didn't join Ned and Jaime when they welcomed Benjen Stark and the Free Folk to Castle Black, and he was not surprised when he was joined by the younger Stark brother. Only a few moments after he arrived, Oberyn even giving up his seat so that Benjen could speak to his nephew, and but a few hours later, it was yet another uncle who was looking down on Jay. A day and a half, you say? Aemon asked as he held Jack's hand in his own and pressed his head against his chest. Aye, a day and a half, Ned Stark said. And this has been like that in all this time? Aemon asked as he pointed to the crown. It has. A few of us tried to remove it, but it doesn't seem to shift at all. Jaime said, and Aemon nodded. Nor you, me, or even Lord Stark here have it in us to take it from Jaime's head. Only one of Stark and Targaryen blood can do so. And other than Jaime Zeres, the only one who shares such blood is Princess Yaya. Aemon said, and Oberyn saw Ned, Benjen, Tyrion, and Jaime all look at each other. Her blood is the same as Jane's? Tyrion asked, and Oberyn almost rose to his feet before he realized it was a different question that Tyrion was asking, and not that he was daring to say that his grandniece was not his nephew's blood. It is. Though it's not quite the same as well, but compared to the magics that you and I possess, nephew, the young princess is closer to her father than you or I will ever be. Aemon said as he finished his examination and turned to look at them. You're saying that in time she'll be able to do what Jay can? Jaime asked, and Aemon shook his head. Perhaps some, if not all. I'm still not sure how much of it passes on. We take our blood from our own fathers and mothers. Mine house takes its own from the 40 of Valyria, and while Tyrion, Shiera, Daenerys, and I have some within us, Jaehaerys has always needed to have more. We are but a sip from this mug. Aemon said, taking a small sip of the water. Jaehaerys is the mug itself. And Elia, he asked curiously. Almost half? I can't be sure. More than me, but less than her father. Aemon said, and Oberyn nodded. When will you wake? Jaime asked worriedly. Ask him yourself. Aemon said with a large beaming smile, and Oberyn and everyone in the room turned to see Jay sitting up in the bed. He's here, his nephew said forebodingly. Castle Black 301 AC, Jaehaerys Targaryen. He stood on the wall and looked out on the lands beyond it, knowing that he was there and he was watching. His first instinct had been to take to the sky and for he and Rhaenys to fly and lay down their flames, but he knew he could not. When the Night King and his army arrived, he and Rhaenys needed to be here. The men needed to see them, and so did the Night King. If not, then he'd know his mind, and Jaehaerys couldn't allow him to know what it was that he knew. Not yet, at least. On his head, he now wore a cloth that covered a shining crown, and he could only imagine how ridiculous he looked. Given the smirks that he'd gotten from Robb, Cregan, his uncles, and Jaime, there was no need for a looking glass to be brought to show him either. It was another thing that the Night King couldn't see until it was too late. Another surprise that Jay needed him to be unaware of. As it was the gods only knew what surprises the Night King had in store for him. A part of him had considered that perhaps what he'd seen had been a trick of some sort, a feint almost, and one that he should be wary of falling for. In time, he'd been more sure that it was not. He'd seen glimpses of the Night King's plans, spent moments in his mind, and only that he risked being detected. He'd have spent more. He knew that he couldn't risk being detected, though, and that the longer they were linked, the more likely it was that the Night King would see some of his own plans. So he'd taken what he could and hoped it was enough, and now he stood and watched and waited. You sure you don't need to rest? Jaime asked as he moved behind him. I've rested for 2 days almost. I miss being awake, he said, and Jaime chuckled. I take it your dreams were not the ones you wished for, then? Jaime asked, and Jay shook his head. I sought ghosts. I wish to see them both, to look upon them before, he said, stopping for a moment to compose himself. I didn't wish him to see them, to know. Could he? Jaime asked worriedly, and Jay shook his head. I don't think so, but I'm not willing to take the chance. Some of the war to come will be fought elsewhere, Jaime. On a field not of my choosing and not truly one that exists, he said, and Jaime looked at him with intrigue. Magic is its own thing, and while this battle will be won in this world, it will also need to be fought in that one too. It was hard to explain what it was he meant, partly because he didn't fully understand it, and partly because he didn't want the Night King to know that he knew. Jaehaerys's mind was closed to him, as was his family's. Fire and ice magic were two opposing forces that repelled one another. That he possessed both allowed him to do as he did. That his family did not meant that the Night King couldn't do so to them. So he and they alone knew the full extent of the plans he'd made. Jaime, Oberyn, his uncles Ned and Benjen, any of them could be open to the Night King's gaze, and so there was only so much he could tell them all. He hated it, despised it, and it made him feel dirty inside to keep things from all those he cared about. Secrets and lies had almost brought about the end of his house. They and a choice made long before even the Conqueror had been born. Over the years, he'd done his best to not lie, to not keep secrets, and he'd succeeded more than he had failed, or so he believed. To come here at this point and to find he now had to keep some more. That had only been something he'd been able to do if he didn't have to speak a lie too. Come, we should eat. He'll not come tonight. Jaime said, and Jay turned to follow him to the lift.